Now we're on Daf Ayin Vav Amid Beis. Shmuel the Amar Ki Aitani holds like a Tana in a Brisa who says Kol Menachos Shariba b'midas Chalosa Shemiyat b'midas Chalosam Ksheros Chutz mi Lechem Aponim v'Chavitei Kohen Gadol. So in other words, the Tanakama of this Brisa omits mention of Lachmei Toda and for that matter the Zirus. And according to this Tanakama, in the cases of Lachmei Toda and Nazirus, if you were Memayit B'mida, it would be possible. But the Brisa goes ahead and quotes a second dissenting opinion, V'yesh Omrim Af Lachmei Toda Nazirus. Even if he was Memayit B'midas Chalosan, it would be Ksheros. So the first Tana doesn't make an exception for Toda. Omer of Huna, Minchas Mafe, Sha'ofa Chala Achas, Yotza. My timer, Matzos Ksiv, without a vav. Maski Flora Papa, time of the Ksiv Matzos, without the vav, Haksiv Matzos Lo. Then we would say that the 10 Lechamim Ali Kuva, Vagabi Lachmi Toda the Ksiv Matzos, the Omer of Tuvi Bar Kisov Shmuel, Lachmi Toda Shafon Arba Chalos Yotza. And the Gemara says, Ahi Pliga. So now we start the Mishnah here on Daf Ayin Vavam Beis. HaOmer Hayaba Isaron Misholosh Se'in. One Isaron of fine flour, which is after you do all the preparation from 3 Se'in, you end up with 1 Isaron. Shtei Alechem is Shtei Esronim Misholosh Se'in. Lechem Aponim Esrim V'Arba Esronim May Esrim V'Arba Soy, my timer. Why is it that in the case of the Omer, all you need is 1 single Isaron, and you started with 3 sos, 3 se'in, and the answer is Keva de Michodesh Asi, since it's coming from the new crop, because that's the nature of Omer. Omer comes from the new crop, is therefore, apparently it contains more of the chaff than the old crop. And not only that, Misa Orinosi, it comes from barley, which contains more chaff. Then Isarim Muvchar Lo Osi El Mishal Sin. We have to bring 3 se'ins worth of flour in order to produce the Omer, meaning the single Isarim of the Omer. Shtei Alechem, says the Mishnah, Shtei Esronos Mishalosh Se'in, came in the Mechitin Asyon, because the Shtei Alechem comes from Chita, and therefore it has less chaff than the case of the Omer, which comes from barley. Is Afal Gav de Michodesh Asyon, even though it's coming from the new crop, is Shtei Esronos Osu Mishalosh Sin. From 3 Se'in, you could produce Shtei Esronos of fine flour. Then the Mishnah says, Lechem upon him Esrim V'Arba Esronos mi Esrim V'Arba Se'in. My timer is Keva de Mechitin Asu Umiyashanos. Now he has 2 additional elements. It's not only Chita, but it's also from Yashan. Right, with regard to Lechem upon him, there's no din of Chadash. Now, Yashan, we said, doesn't have much of the chaff left. Wheat in general, compared to barley, doesn't have that much chaff. Is therefore Yisor Muvchar Osi Misio. You can get the Yisor of your choice from a single saw. Tana Rabbanan learned to the bicycle Menachos Sheriba b'midas esrona Moshe midas esrona psulos. Riba b'midos sein shalahem o midas o miet b'midas sein shalahem ksheros. So if the mincha does not contain an exact isaron, either because the measuring vessel was too large, or he measured out an isaron and a half, or he heaped the flour above the vessel's rim, then in all these cases, psulos. If there's more than an isaron in a mincha, the kometz will be invalid. We need an exact isaron. Now, instead of an initial amount of 3 soin for barley, or for the sake of the omer, they began with 4 sa'in or 2. This does not affect the validity of the korban because the initial amount was ordained only by the Rabbanan. Mishnah says, "Omer hayamenupa b'sholosh esrei napa." Right, they sifted it through 13 sieves. Shtei lechem b'shtemesrei, 12 sieves. Lechem aponim b'achadesrei. Reb Shimon Omer lo hoya lahen kitzva. There's no set amount of sieving or sieves. Elasoles menupe kol tzarka hayamevi. He has to bring flour that had already been sifted as much as necessary. Shenemar v'lakachta soles v'afisa osa ad shete menupa kol tzarka. Again, at the end of the Mishnah, let's review. We have Rabbi Shimon. His opinion is lo hoyelem kitzva. Right, the number of sieves was not set by the Torah. Ella, but rather soles menupa kol tzarka hayamevi. Just bring flour that had already been sifted as much as necessary. Shenemar v'lakachta soles v'afisa osa. So you could buy fine flour from the market. Ad shete menupa kol tzarka. Tanrabanan b'daka begasa. So the way it was sifted was through a fine sieve, through a coarse one, through a fine sieve, through a coarse one. Rabbi Shimon Elazar Omer shloshes rei nafos hayu b'migdash. There were 13 different sieves in the migdash. Zulam al mizu v'zulam al mizu. Elyona koletes subin and tachtona koletes solis. So the upper one, which is relatively coarse, that collected the bran, and the lower one, which is relatively fine, collects the fine flour. Reb Shimon Omer lo hayam kitzvot on Rabbanan. The Brisa quotes a pasuk, soles v'afisa osa malamich nikacha soles, which means that you could buy the flour for lechem aponim as fine flour, and it has already been sifted. Uminayin shafilu chitin. How do we know that this applies in preparing the lechem aponim, that you could buy wheat and sift it themselves? They could already sift it themselves. Told milom v'lakachta mikol makom. So that's as far as the lechem aponim is concerned. Yachal, I might think, therefore, that af b'shar menachos kain, you could buy wheat for other mincha offerings. Tamilomer osa. There's a mir in the word osa, and it limits the heter to buy wheat to the lechem aponim Mipnei chisaron. Right, this is the principle of a Torah chasa. So what is the chisaron here? The Gemara says that the Torah teaches that only in the case of lechem aponim it's permissible to buy fine wheat, fine flour. You have the two choices, wheat or fine flour. One who brings a private mincha may not buy wheat and sift it himself, but rather he must buy fine flour that's already been sifted to the necessary degree. Not everyone is an expert at sifting. Therefore, the Torah allowed them to buy wheat, and that's less expensive than fine flour for the lechem aponim. Heicha remiza d'chsiv v'ishkisa es ha'eda v'es be'ira. Mahadran alecha elu menachos.